These are nice chairs.
They are.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome, good evening, everyone here at the library at the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences, and those people who are watching online or later on YouTube and other platforms. Last night here we had a special occasion where we hosted Jake Sullivan, who's the former National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden, of course. But we at the IWM, we never rest on our laurels. And I think those of you who are here will find that what you're going to see and hear this evening is as exciting and interesting, and in some respects you're going to learn new things which you never realized you didn't know. Because tonight's lecturer is Julie Klinger, who is an associate professor. She's just changed from being associate professor at the University of Delaware to being associate professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm not even going to try and explain what she's an associate professor of, because it's a very long title, but suffice to say it involves critical raw materials. And what we're going to be looking at today is what are supply chains? What do supply chains mean to our environment and our politics when it comes to the issue of critical raw materials? And she's got an extremely engaging PowerPoint stroke keynote to guide us through this quite remarkable world. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Julie to take the floor, and there will of course be opportunities for questions after. I'm going to sit down in the front so that I can see the PowerPoint. Oh, it's disappeared, the PowerPoint. That's bad, because it's absolutely critical to the whole presentation, I happen to know. So I'm standing here improvising and looking nervously at the...
We can also take it as an invitation to take a deep breath, you know, stretch.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be gripped by what's on the screen.
Here we are.
There we are.
I think we're back. Fantastic. Julie.
All right. Thank you.
And afterwards we'll have questions, of course.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Misha, and thank you everyone for being here. This is just really, today is actually my very last day in Vienna. I know, heartbreaking. But I'm just brimming with gratitude for all of the fellows here, and of course the staff who make this magical place what it is. So this is the starting point for a lot of my research. My overarching project here has been called Critical Raw Materials and Computing Futures on Earth and in Space. And so if you've heard about critical raw materials, you've probably heard of it in the context of the energy transition and in the context of scarcity, disorder, opportunity even. You've probably encountered narratives like this. Now, before we dive in, I want to give you a little bit of sense of where I'm speaking from. So I have here a slide with a lot of text on it. You don't need to go blind reading it. But when I say my research, it really is a group effort made possible by substantial material support and enriched considerably with my co-thinkers, which includes PhD students, graduates and postdocs, faculty colleagues, and of course, fellows and staff here who have inspired me over our wonderful lunches and other engagements. So what I bring to my public talks is a collectivity of research that is global in scope. So given that our interest collectively is in making sense of global supply chains from holes in the ground to stuff in outer space, being in an intellectual community and in many respects, leading and directing the research on topics like this. Again, you don't have to go blind reading it. Just kind of let your eyes play over it and pick up the key words that cover global geography, extra global as well. There's the moon and a rocket ship there as well. And also playing with different forms of methods and data and approaches. So this is the context from which I am speaking to you today about geopolitics and 4D, right? So the last sort of the preliminaries that I'll share with you is this. I believe the talk abstract promised a framework. But informed by my conversations with many of you here today and the discussions that I had with new friends and colleagues in Belgrade this past week, I've decided to take a cue from those discussions and focus more on a set of stories or illustrative narratives. To be honest, because I have an ideological agenda. I have an intellectual agenda and a scientific agenda. I want all of you to come away from here, if not with a fully formed conviction of how your dearest cause intersects with subterranean and orbital spaces, with at least the seeds of that idea taking root that you hopefully will never be able to shake loose again. So if you want a framework, feel free to read these papers. Also my book, you don't have to pay for it. You can download it for free. And I'll show this slide at the end as well. And of course, we can get into theories and frameworks in the Q&A. So, why geopolitics? I would say that still, the beating heart of geopolitical theorizing and strategy is territorial. But territorial processes, pretty much any example that you can think of, these are fed by mining and space-based and space-linked technologies. And so you could say that the mineral flows and the information and data flows enabled by both of those spaces are kind of like the arteries of the beating heart of our geopolitical work and theory and practice. And a heart without arteries is just a lump of dead flesh, right? So similarly, I would argue that political theorization and strategy without taking mineral and information flows into account is kind of dead in the water, and that's a scary thing to consider in these times. So this matters immediately, I would say, for struggles against authoritarianism. It can also help us visibilize the lines of asphyxiation of democracy. And it can hopefully inform the identification of newer and more strategic terrains of theory and practice in the interest of democracy, democratization, and peace and stability. So I think on some level we all know this, right? But we've all been trained to invisibilize these arteries, this vasculature. And so I'll talk through a couple of ways in which we can make it visible, but I hope that this provokes further thought in each of you. And why 4D? I mean, well, because in addition to the subterranean and the orbital, which renders territory from a flat Cartesian terrain to something volumetric, we also have to take into account time, the fourth dimension, right? Because it's the dynamism and the movement and the contingency and the radical possibility that we unescapably inhabit because of the movement of time that I think makes all of our work so interesting and important. And also, why 4D? Well, because the late Joseph Nye took the Geopolitics in 3D title in 2002. He was using it metaphorically in a short piece that was published in the Canadian edition of Time magazine, and he was arguing for Canadian troops to stay engaged in the US-led war on terror. Right, he didn't deal with subterranean or orbital dimensions I'm talking about here, even though if we're talking about, for example, Canadian involvement in Afghanistan, the subterranean and the orbital are all here implicit in this image, right? The subterranean is here in the hardware that you see. And of course, the orbital, as host to satellite infrastructure, is crucial to the communications, positioning, and intelligence that guides military operations. So I would say, with no disrespect to the late, great Joseph Nye, that that's a real missed opportunity for such a great title. But it does give us something interesting to talk about and think with tonight. So, to illustrate this point, policy unmaking in offices protests in the streets and radical changes in the relative freedom of movement of different groups of people are generally considered to be terrestrial affairs. Yet these are often directly and indirectly shaped by access to and power within space-based and space-linked technological systems. My point of entry here, of course, is our phone, which at any given point is triangulating between at least 3 satellites right now in real time, harvesting information, et cetera. So these technological systems rely on hardware, and hardware is made of raw materials that are wrested from the Earth by human labor and their automated proxies. And so subterranean spaces and the political economies that dictate power and privilege in relation to them are always also part of political struggles that are unfolding on the surface. So this means that places that may be considered too far away or too remote to be of immediate interest to whatever our concerns are always already materially present. And so I want to ask you to challenge and to provoke where actually you might be able to credibly draw the line between power struggles over land and resources, which is to say the question to mine, the question to build, the question to go to war, where you can draw a line between that and regimes of labor organization, which is to say the right or disempowerment of people to define what they do with their waking hours, or over the geographies of movement, detention, deportation, and citizenship. And here I'm also foreshadowing the wonderful talk you'll have with Leah P. Coming here soon, right? The right to people to be on the move, right? So you can draw lines between technologies, labor regimes, holes in the ground, outer space, based on jurisdiction, based on attention, based on interest, based on focus, but you can't draw any lines based on relevance, right? And I think differentiating the two between jurisdiction, attention, and focus, and relevance and significance is a really important analytical move that might help us get out of any impasses that we're confronting, thinking through and rethinking our work in our moment of metastasizing authoritarianism. So, with all of that, I bring you to a very brief theory interlude. Right. So I am not alone in the scholarly universe. There are many different theories and concepts that are helpful for us to theorize geopolitics in 4D. So I think a foundational one is John Agnew's concept of the territorial trap, which refers to the mistaken notion that is all too common in international relations and public discourse that state politics and power are coherent and consistent and synonymous with territorial borders, right? In fact, that's often not the case. Power is sloppily related to territory at best and unevenly enforced. Building on that, of course, what I alluded to earlier, that territory and geopolitics are not flat, right? But for far too long, our geopolitical theories and strategies have been. So the body of work that deals with volumetric geopolitics really thinks through how power struggles play out in complex 4-dimensional materialities of the upper atmosphere, the deep ocean, outer space, as well as the infrastructural and information flows that cross all of these spaces. And then, sorry, it's just a little bit off here, but bear with me. All right, so an emergent field of political geology starts from the premise that geological knowledge production is never neutral, right? Geological knowledge making, representation, and thought, they've been inscribed by, and they also reinscribe different political activities and the interests of those in power. And so the question is, how do you operationalize all of this? Yes, everything is very big and interconnected, and there's a number of different analytical moves that scholars have made. The one that I've chosen to share with you tonight is Gabrielle Hecht's concept of interscalar vehicles. She's a historian of the uranium trade centered in Africa. But what she's formulated is this way of following a material object, radioactivity, a metal, a piece of technology, following it actually through space and time, and then seeing what kind of biogeophysical realities are revealed, what kind of new potential political alliances that might otherwise be erased or might otherwise be overlooked, what might emerge if you actually follow the thing. And so the key point in all of this is that the physical and the material, these are all also political relationships. And so I invite you to maybe think about what your primary cause may be and to think about how an issue or project that is near and dear to your heart plays out across multiple scales, right? Identify the scale here where maybe your action is focused. And I want you to push your mind into scalar domains that are maybe a little bit less familiar, out of reach, or not as interesting. And I want you to do this with me. Take a moment and do this with me to prime your mind with questions, with a sense of unknowing, so that you're ready to meet what comes next. Recalling, of course, that this is just kind of a schematic diagram, and in reality, scalar divisions are always colliding and intersecting. So here's what comes next: orbital geography. Right, so with our hearts and minds open now, hopefully with the reflexes of any kind of epistemological agoraphobia that we might confront when thinking about outer space, it's time for a little bit of an orbital geography lesson. Right? In case you're not familiar, this is where Earth's orbits are located, generally divided into 3 domains. There's the LEO, the low Earth orbit, that's located at 2,000 kilometers and below. This is where you have communication and remote sensing satellites, as well as the Hubble Space Telescope. There's the MEO, or the middle Earth orbit, mid-Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, which is a much larger ring between 2,000 kilometers and 35,000 kilometers, where you have navigation systems such as GPS, satellite radios, as well as polar communication systems. And then there's the GEO, right, which is located at 35,786 kilometers straight up from the equator, where you have telecommunications and search and rescue. And so I'll give you just a little bit of a science lesson here. So let's say my head is the Earth, right? Lower Earth orbit, satellites are moving quickly, right? This is really useful for repeated passes to track changes over time. Medium Earth orbit, they're a little bit more slowly. Right? If something's in geostationary orbit, I'm going to start orbiting now. As the Earth turns, the satellite stays in a fixed position relative to the surface of the Earth. And so this is really important for bouncing signals, for continuous monitoring, and all of this. And so you can imagine now, with this newfound appreciation of orbital space, that actually orbital space is highly valuable real estate. Right? A domain of commercial and geostrategic competition. Now, this slide here gives you a sense of the function of many of the different satellites that are currently in orbit, and a breakdown between commercial, government, military, civilian, and we'll say combined purposes. One of the things I'd like to draw your attention to is that the number of defunct satellites or junk satellites far outnumbers the operational satellites. Right? And this adds another dimension to orbital geography, which is to say that orbital space is not only crowded, it is also polluted. Right, so here we have an image generated by a creative studio in collaboration with the European Space Agency that just gives you a sense of the quantity of debris that is in orbital space. And so think about the implications of this, right? So the vast majority of orbital debris has been generated by a very small handful of more powerful countries. And this limits the space, limits the access for relative newcomers to outer space. And so in a manner that really closely resembles the geography of the historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, only a few countries actually generate most of the junk. And deliberations, discussions about what to do about the orbital debris problem are ongoing, much like climate action and policy discussions. But there's also very similar problems about the kind of lack of serious commitment on the part of those who are most historically responsible. So the other thing that I'd like to bring your attention to when we think about the the geography of Earth's orbit is that the geography of launch sites doesn't actually correspond with the geography of which countries are launching stuff into outer space. So here we have the countries that dominate orbital space, relying on this visual here from the visual capitalist. And then here we have a study that's showing where different launch sites are located, red being operating, orange is closed, blue is pre-operating. And then this figure over here shows where they're located on lines of latitude. And you'll note here that the vast majority are located in equatorial regions. Right. So this is, of course, for physical reasons as well, right? If you're closer to the equator, the velocity of Earth's spinning is faster, and so rockets can take advantage of that to use less fuel to shoot off into outer space. It's a lot more expensive, takes a lot more fuel to do that at higher or lower latitudes. Or at higher latitudes. But this does mirror the geographies of exploitation and environmental injustice that have characterized relations between global north and equatorial regions for quite some time. And to really drive home the significance of this, I'd like you to take a look at this image now. And I'd like you to look at the smoke. And I'd like you to consider what this smoke is actually made of. Right? This smoke, it's comprised of condensation, of course, but also combusted rocket fuels, which contains all sorts of metals and different chemicals. So this smoke also contains immense quantities of metallic nanoparticulate. These metallic nanoparticles proliferate over immense distances, and they are also released on the rocket's entire trajectory up through the atmosphere. So they're ultralight, they're largely unmeasured, and therefore unseen. And that means they move into living systems of plants and animals, and once they get there, they behave in specific ways that are really only beginning to be researched. So drawing on some research done by some colleagues at the University of New Mexico in the nephrology division, they were looking at how gadolinium behaves when it interacts with cells in different bodily systems. And so here you have, there's what they call subcellular metallic shrapnel, gadolinium and phosphorus, and you can see how it's interacting with a lipid cell, particularly here, right? So really compromising the integrity of the cells at a microscopic scale. And of course, these metals discernibly accumulate in plants, right? And so here we have an image showing cadmium bioaccumulation. Cadmium, by the way, toxic heavy metal, but it is being marketed as a safer alternative to hydrazine, which is currently used in rocket fuels and propellants. And so, of course, you have the proliferation of these materials through the environment. And depending on the context of the launch site, animals, and then maybe eventually humans, eat the plants or eat the animals that eat the plants. So you see now that orbital geography is not just up there, right? It's not just beyond our atmosphere, but in a very real way, it's volumetric and multiscalar in every sense of the word. So the confluence of the very big and the very small that I've just illustrated for you here should also help us kind of overcome this, I mean, not to be indelicate, but a little bit of a size problem when it comes to actually thinking rigorously and analytically about how to confront the various challenges that are unfolding before us. And by the size problem that plagues so much epistemology is this idea somehow that size equals significance. If something is very big, it's therefore more significant and more important than things that are very small. And while that may apply in cultural domains in terms of influence or what have you, when we're actually talking about the material world, we have to be attentive across all scales. So now on orbital politics. This, which shows the distribution of dominance by country. I was putting this together and I thought it would be boring, really in the extreme, not to mention a tremendous waste of fellowship opportunity here in Vienna, to only talk to you about what the US, Russia, and China are doing. So I want to call your attention to the others here. Right? Others include 627 satellites. They've been built globally, and I want to give you just a snapshot of the dynamism of satellite production that's happening globally, but focused on Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, and West Asia. So just enjoy a little bit of a timeline here. 2009, Switzerland. 2012, Hungary, Romania, Poland. 2013, Estonia, and so on. And so this should give you a sense of the tremendous dynamism and, in fact, in a way, democratization of outer space. Now, the countries that I've listed here, according to this timeline, are countries that have chosen to develop a CubeSat, a very small satellite, as their very first one. A CubeSat, it's kind of cute, actually. It's 10 centimeters cubed. They weigh anywhere between 1 and 10 kilos. And this size dimension is the minimum size that can actually be tracked by ground-based satellite scanning radar. So satellites, like other new development projects, they can be cost prohibitive. Space technology development, like other development projects, can take many forms, some of which deepen foreign debt and dependency, and others which foster greater national autonomy. And really the difference between those two comes down to a combination of institutional arrangements and the specific technologies involved and who is actually dictating the form that development will take. And so because they're small, they're cheap, and they use just commercially available off-the-shelf technologies, cube satellites often serve as a first step toward autonomous national space capacity. Now, autonomous national space capacity really, really matters in very fundamental ways when we're talking about basic conditions of sovereignty, particularly in our contemporary era, right? So the ability to see and know your own territory rather than needing to rely on the largesse of others to provide satellite imagery for you, is really important, particularly if there are emergent events, natural disasters, conflict, the movement of terrorist groups, or real need to provide aid to a particular community, or to monitor floods, or to monitor crop output, or things like this. To be able to determine on your own terms within your national territory what a satellite is going to be looking at over a given period of time is really important, right? But this also means that even though we're living in an era of unprecedented surveillance of Earth's surface, there's lots of barriers imposed by costs, proprietary claims, and limitations in infrastructure and technical expertise that still limit who actually has the basic right to see and know their territory from above. Now, of course, a satellite floating around in orbit is pretty worthless without the ground infrastructure to receive signals and also the human minds to organize and interpret this constant stream of incoming data and translate it into something that is actionable for different entities and institutions. So the geography of ground receiving stations is significant. I've written about this elsewhere in the context of space development in Latin America. And it is one reason, if you do a little bit of a news search, why China's stations in Tunisia and Argentina and in Arctic waters have garnered Western attention in recent years. So it can be a real challenge, to quote Gabrielle Hecht, the person who developed the concept of an interscalar vehicle. She says that it can be a real challenge to hold the planet and a place on the planet on the kind of same analytical plane in terms of political theorizing and thinking about meaningful forms of action. But this is really, I think, what we must do to rise to the current moment. And so thinking through satellites, orbital infrastructures, and that sort of thing is just one way that we can think through multiple scales simultaneously. So now I want to talk a little bit about the geopolitical stakes of satellite access, infrastructure, and ownership. These stakes are quite high. Ukraine gives us one example. So here we have a satellite image provided by Maxar Technologies in 2022 that shows a 3.25-mile-long convoy of Russian ground forces with hundreds of military vehicles, northeast of Ivankiv, moving toward Kyiv, 40 miles away. So there's all kinds of military equipment here: tanks, fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, etc. In 2022, February of 2022, there's a headline here: commercial spy satellites put Russia's Ukraine invasion in the public eye. And the story, part of the story reads as follows. Last week, Daniel Yablonsky, Maxar's president and CEO, told Wall Street analysts that the company is, quote, working to increase global transparency. He said in a February 28 statement to Space News that Maxar has made much of this imagery available to news organizations to support global transparency and combat the spread of disinformation. He goes on to say, we're proud of our contributions to the public discourse around this situation and hopeful for a peaceful resolution. Now, the part of the company that continues to provide imagery to news journalists around the world continues to be active, providing imagery to other journalists, other causes outside of Ukraine. Despite the events that I'm describing here, in early March of this year, Maxar Technology cut off intelligence to Ukraine after Trump ordered a halt to military aid and intelligence sharing. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Maxar, as a private firm, they could have ignored this. Think about other examples where big private firms have ignored or drug their feet on government directives, but they chose not to. And so Ukraine was flying blind almost overnight. Now, after the military aid and intelligence sharing resumed a week later, Maxar's satellite imagery services were not made available on a free basis. They are available again, but only if Ukraine pays for them. And this is because the free access was previously paid for under a US government program, and that program remains suspended. So this remains the case even after Ukraine's mineral deal, which I think we'll discuss probably more of in the Q&A. But this is a good segue, I think, to the Subterranean. So I'm going to share with you a vignette from my previous research in Brazil to illustrate also, I think, the stakes and the dilemmas that emerge when we're thinking across subterranean and orbital spaces. So during a 2018 visit to a South American space agency, I stood with the lead engineer for a satellite development project outside of their clean room. So it's very impressive, right? We were looking through the wall of windows. There were figures clad in head to toe in clean gear. And it's in a beautiful, immense gymnasium-like white room. And the satellite is this gold foil wrapped masterpiece of human engineering. So this was to be the latest in an Earth observation satellite put together jointly by China and Brazil, and their Earth observation research program that's 40 years old. And one of its primary stated purposes is to monitor deforestation. And so when I heard about this, I remarked about the ongoing situation in Madre de Dios in Peru. So this particularly devastating scene in the Amazon rainforest, it's created by an explosion in recent years in artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And this is just a tiny part of the picture. This is an aerial photo. I'm sorry that the lights are kind of washing it out. One of the things and there's been a number of efforts to intervene, including multi-state military interventions. But the extraction continues because demand for gold continues, and people continue without livelihood alternatives. And so I asked, thinking about this, I asked the engineer if it were possible that any gold extracted from Madre de Dios might have found its way into this satellite. Or more to the point, if there were actually any measures in place to keep illegally extracted gold from making its way into any scientific instrumentation, right? The way that there might be certification schemes for gold jewelry, for certain designated conflict minerals, et cetera. And after a thoughtful pause, he stated that he really had no idea, had honestly never thought of such a thing before, but sincerely hoped that the satellite could help in efforts to stop such things from happening. And so, to really drive this point home, there we go. This product of a 40-year collaboration between China and Brazil to monitor Earth resources, the people who are centrally involved in it, from design to construction and so on, no one can say, one way or another, if the satellite that provides data to help people monitor and interdict rainforest and destruction, whether or not it's comprised of material that's violently extracted from the rainforest, right? And so this conversation continued over dinner. We talked about the violence of gold mining, the violence of extraction. People expressed sadness and rage and frustration about their inability, really, to directly engage this. People expressed fear and awe about the violence that can be involved in some of these spaces. But ultimately, they expressed exasperation and dismay. The situation with gold mining is so chaotic and so violent. How can they possibly be expected to answer for where their materials come from? So with this example, with this vignette, I want to do more than simply point out the connections. What emerges from this ethnographic vignette is a really profound circumscription of individual agency, even among people who have devoted their lives to pursuing the training, to be in a career that is devoted toward doing cutting-edge science and research in order to make the world a better place. Right? That's a profound moment of alienation and discomfort. And there may be denial, denouncement, dismay, and defeatism among project specialists, or any one of us who awakens to something like this that maybe we weren't aware of previously. But there's no disconnecting our work and the materials that we work with from these larger geographies of violence. And so I want to continuing with the thread of the very big and the very small. I want to really make explicit the geographies that these beautiful technologies are inseparable from, right? So extraction processes, particularly for artisanal and small-scale gold mining, they involve the use of mercury and cyanide. Mercury is used to recover minute pieces of gold that might be mixed in soil and sediments. And then the mercury is vaporized, which is to say set on fire. People often breathe that without protection, and then gold is extracted by vaporizing the mercury. So like the metallic nanoparticulate from rocket launches, mercury from gold mining operations, these travel far and wide, and they lodge themselves in living systems, and it enacts intergenerational harm. To emphasize this, I share with you a study that was published in Scientific Reports of the Nature family of magazines that's showing the presence of mercury in an ovarian follicle. So you can see mercury here, and just for contrast, here's a follicle without mercury. So these materials, in their tiny, most infinitesimal form, lodge themselves in human systems and enact intergenerational harm in a way that we're only figuring out how to even measure. And so what this raises fundamentally are questions of ownership, control, questions of sovereignty, from the national to the bodily, questions of oversight. And I think the fact that, well, I choose to interpret the fact that wherever we look for these connections, we find them. I choose to interpret that as cause for optimism, because there's no shortage of opportunities and possibilities for meaningful intervention, for constructing new solidarities. And so this should be encouraging, even if the new knowledge itself is anguishing. So if we return to our CubeSat example, following this logic through, I'd like to draw your attention to the battery board here. Now, among other things, these batteries are often contain lithium. And the current lithium supply chain is overwhelmingly dominated. Well, Australia produces it, but then China processes it. And then from China, it flows into a range of different products. These here indicates the EVs, which is how lithium is generally talked about. And so the Western world has recently decided that this state of affairs is a very real problem, Previously, it was a solution for a number of different business and environmental concerns, but now it's a problem. And so that has brought lithium prospecting to many different places, including, most recently, the location that I've been able to learn about and visit, which was located in Serbia. So the Jadar Valley in Serbia, it's been promoted as a greener and closer source of lithium to help the EU achieve its EV goals. And it's more just in some ways than sourcing from Latin America. But it has also been fiercely contested because it would be the world's first lithium mine in a productive agricultural region. A study that was published in Scientific Reports, again in the Nature family of journals last year, was showing some of the impacts that were being experienced just as a result of the water wells that were being dug for testing. So this image here, it shows, so here we have a water well that was dug for testing and prospecting. This image shows the fact that it's leaking, it's seeping. And the problem with this is that this is subsurface water that is carrying with it some of the elements that are naturally present in the geological ore body. The unfortunate thing is that some of those elements are things that are not good for people or crops, like boron and arsenic. And so farmers have noticed the impact here. And then it's been noted, or this study published, that the quantity of these materials was significantly higher downstream of these operations. And so it's hard for local people to believe that things will somehow get better once the operations start, given that there's a lack of controls at this stage. And so what we know about the movement of contaminants through the ecosystem is that even if an area is covered in green, as indicated in these computer-generated images here that I sourced from the company website, that doesn't necessarily mean that the area is devoid of hazardous materials. And so I want to take a step back here and note that the politics of expertise, they shape who has the power to define a space or a technology. And I've been thinking about this in relation to an observation that was made by one of the permanent fellows here from Serbia, in which he said that everyone has had to become an expert in lithium in some way. Communities have to then become experts in navigating legal matters and understanding transnational capital flows and supply chains and corporate structures. And then governments and universities have to become experts in tracking disasters. So this video was playing when you walked in. And I'm not suggesting a similarity between the proposed operations in Jadar Valley and the Brumadinho mining disaster that occurred in Brazil in 2019. But while this video is playing, I would like to make the larger point about how when that once-in-a-century event happens, where there's a once-in-a-century flood or a rare earthquake or a landslide or something like this that renders the structures that we're supposed to keep an operation contained, that renders them, I guess, hazardous or even causes structural failure, it's then communities, governments, and universities that have to become the experts in figuring out how to clean up, figuring out how to measure the problem, figuring out how to even move on. And so stepping back to the geopolitical concept, right, these territorial processes, whether it's extraction or a launch site or what have you, these are also geopolitical processes, right? So, for example, the imposition of a mine in the first place erases other things that came before. This is something I've noted and written about for a number of years. But then if you think about it from a land-based perspective, a disastrous pollution event is also a territorial and geopolitical event because it renders that space unusable for other purposes, including for dreams of national development. And when we think about the geographies of extraction between less powerful and more powerful states, this has long-lasting, multi-generational consequences. And so we'll wrap up now with just a brief historical interlude, because I've emphasized the importance of thinking in a multiscalar way, of reconceptualizing subterranean and orbital spaces as woven into whatever your given concern or cause might be. But I also want to emphasize that maybe not all of this is super new. Right, what we're struggling with to kind of overcome our received frameworks, particularly those of us who came of age in an era of post-Cold War triumphalism about the triumph of democracy and cosmopolitanism, referring to myself here, we're really realizing the limits of an assumption of a rules-based liberal world order as somehow the order of the day, and thinking about how to move on. But these struggles about how to make sense of overwhelming phenomena, about how to make sense of potentially world-ending issues are not new. And so I'll give you an example from 19th century Italy, 19th century Habsburg Empire. So here we have an engraving representing the earthquake of Messina in Sicily in 1783. And take a look at what's being represented here. Here we have another image that shows the destruction of the interior of the Zagreb Cathedral after the earthquake of 1880. Here we have a photograph, right? This is later in time, technology had developed. Now, in order to make sense of an overwhelming phenomenon, I'm using an earthquake as an example, but I hope you can think with me about lots of other overwhelming phenomena that we're confronting. You need a distributed perspective. And this distributed perspective played out quite differently between the Habsburg Empire, where scientists were struggling along with political currents of struggles between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. Do they conduct science according to political boundaries or according to linguistic or cultural boundaries? It was always kind of an unsettled question. Versus, and there's archival records that show seismologists during the Habsburg Empire really envying the organization and centralization of Italy, where in the Italian context, they had a centralized data collection system, a centralized bureau that sent out people to collect reports whenever there had been an earthquake, and that also meant that they had a centralized disaster response system to help people. Not the case in the Habsburg Empire, where data collection was left really to itinerant teachers to speak local languages, and that also meant that help was not flowing to people as readily or as quickly. But I think it's because geophysical phenomena challenge the state, and because of the fact that even when we're talking about large-scale collective shared experience, like an earthquake, like climate change, like dizzying political shifts, it's actually the immediate and the local and the embodied. These are the sites through which all of the scales come together. These are the scales at which sense-making ultimately happens, and these are the scales from which solutions, actions, ideas, and creativity ultimately flow. Therefore, the questions of who is heard, who is excluded, who is talked over, whose potential is cut short by arbitrary political or economic deprivation, these actually become paramount questions. So, in other words, in the past, as well as in our perhaps unprecedented times, unprecedented in some, not so in others, the same old struggles for equality and justice and equity and the diversity of perspectives, all of these remain central in order for the advancement of human knowledge and for technology development to actually be driven by something that actually resembles a meritocracy, as opposed to something that's driven by people who are disproportionately empowered and others are arbitrarily excluded on the basis of identity markers. And so these are questions that are only more relevant today. We're in a moment of a dizzying collapse of life chances and the dizzying rise of hybrid authoritarian regimes. And we see attacks on inclusion and diversity and equity precisely because they threaten to establish an actual meritocracy. So in the interest of time, I'm going to end here because I'd like to give us time to kind of dig into the discussions. But the final thing that I would like to say is that geopolitics in 4D, right? Subterranean, orbital, Earth, and how these all things how all of these things change and evolve through time, how they intersect with people in the streets and people in offices. All of these things, they're not new, right? It's been here the whole time. It's a way to kind of rethink, but I hope also inspire us to have some fun, to think about building new solidarities and being creative as we think about how to move on from our present moment. Thank you. All right. And also, I've spent plenty of time in these chairs, so maybe stand up and stretch, and then, we'll be ready for the discussion. Don't be shy. Stand up, stretch. Stand up, stretch. Right. Come on. We can take 30 seconds. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Julie, thanks very much. I'm not quite sure where to start because there's so much ground that is covered there. But I think, going to your conclusion, you point out at the end that this is not new. I would argue that satellites are relatively new, but more important than that, what is different about what you're describing now from relatively recent histories is the scale of it. The scale is unimaginable, and for the first time, though, we can at least comprehend and visualize both the vastness of things and, as you point out, the nano aspects when it comes to particulates, for example. And this scale in itself is, we could argue, is a threat. And the scale also threatens, notwithstanding what I just said, to outrun human ability to comprehend these processes, because at each stage of the processes that you talked, from the orbital down to the nanoparticulates, requires exceptional knowledge to grasp what's going on. So does scale itself become a threat?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's, as with these, I could answer that question with respect to scale the same way I could answer that question with respect to, say, satellite technology. It depends on who wields it and for what purposes. So, for example, I mentioned that there is a little bit of an issue with equating size with significance. Right? And so, for example, things that occur at the very small scale, particularly those issues that might only manifest in individuals, right, in the process of lived experience, they have to rise to the level of aggregate statistics in order to be viewed as significant. But if we think through the implications of that and what a sort of an individual's experience with contamination might mean in terms of their life chances. And if we think about what that might mean in terms of potential cut short, and we think about what that might mean in terms of the loss of a potentially brilliant contribution to human society, culture, politics, or science, that, I think, should arrest us a little bit and arrest and then awaken to the importance then of intervening on multiple scales, right? So scale is a threat if one scalar level or mode of organization is used to erase the significance and the life chances and the power of people and communities at other scales. In my line of work, we often see this in relation to extractive projects or launch site infrastructures. The the outer spatial, is invoked as so much more important and so much more significant than this community or that community, without thinking about what the future possibilities might be if this community or that community are allowed to live and live well.
Now, one of the things that that was implicit throughout your talk, but which you didn't really raise, although I know it's something that you think a lot about, is whether all the requirements in terms of the green energy transition, but also when we're talking about critical minerals, the military requirements of these minerals. Are we able to satisfy those requirements without ripping the Earth apart in such a way as to render life on Earth pretty difficult?
Yeah, it depends on what we decide to hold constant in answering that question. So if we decide to hold constant whatever status quo this is, which economically is, an annual 3% growth rate, GDP, and then increased rates of military spending, both of which have profound implications, direct implications for material demand. If those are the things we hold constant, then yeah, there's no hope, right? But collectively, and then among different societies, and then at multiple scales, we've shown tremendous potential to decide that we're going to hold something else constant, right? To decide, for example, that human rights are the thing that need to be held constant, as imperfect as that project has been, right? And so if we decide, speaking of the energy transition, if we decide that the thing that we need to hold constant is staying the acceleration of global warming, then you make adjustments around that. And those adjustments include things that have material implications. Conversely, if we decide that human security is the priority, and that's the thing that we hold constant, then you reorganize a whole host of spending priorities and supply chains around that. And in that question, particularly in the context of Russian aggression, there is a place for defense supply chains. But there's not a place for war profiteers, right? So we can get into that further, but I think you have other questions.
I've just got, because I'm sure there are going to be questions from the floor, I've just got one other, which is purely a point of information, as it were. Up there, you had that the US has 1,308 satellites, and yet, my understanding, Elon Musk's Starlink has 6,000 satellites alone. So are those figures, what do they include? They obviously don't include Starlink.
Right, exactly. So those are, thank you, I should have clarified this, but those figures, those include large-scale satellites that have been launched under the auspices of a government program.
Right.
Right. And so what that figure doesn't include are satellites that have been launched by private providers for private purposes. There are thousands more.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's actually much, much more crowded than those figures would suggest. And this is really, but this is, I mean, talking about setting priorities. There really is a race now to dominate communications networks in particular through the release of satellites sanctioned by governments, but actually the projects are private commercial projects rather than for the benefit of nation states, however that's interpreted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Starlink is, I think, the most prominent in people's minds, but there is, as you mentioned, this race to launch constellations, right? So OneWeb in the UK is partnering with the Rwandan government, and the Rwandan government is applying for launch permits on behalf of OneWeb in the UK for, I think the proposal that I heard last was something on the order of tens of thousands of small satellites, right? And so were this a slightly different talk, we would talk about how a CubeSat is really enabling, right? Particularly for newcomers to space activities, particularly for countries that can't justify or don't want to justify allocating a significant amount of funding. But a smaller and more accessible technology is accessible to everyone. And that means also those with more economic resources. And so Switzerland may have put up one CubeSat, but the United States has launched, I think, 1,700. Right?
I'm going to hand it. I saw Veronica's hand first.
Sorry.
Oh, can you wait, Veronica, till the and identify yourself?
Sorry, I'm Veronica Buckley, and thank you for an absolutely super talk. A very basic question. I can't help but be struck by the extraordinary interdisciplinarity of all that you are doing. And I'm wondering how you or how people are now training a new cadre of experts to address these issues. You've brought, there's biochemicals, there's metals, metal fatigue underwater, metal fatigue in space, all sorts of any number of things. Who is being prepared to address these issues? How is it happening in the universities? And is there any foundation anywhere who is looking to bring a large group of young people together as a sort of cohort to be trained in the interdisciplinarity of this thing?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think there's been a lot of move and push toward interdisciplinarity or even post-disciplinarity. I think over the past 2 decades with particular intensity, but of course how that actually plays out really varies across institutional context. For my own part, when I got to a point that my research questions exceeded my training, my strategy was to fundraise to recruit people who had the expertise but wanted to do something else. So, for example, among the PhD students that I have the privilege to work with, there's people with backgrounds in mining engineering, working with satellite technology, doing geological field surveys, and people with experience in laboratory sciences. And so it's really the collaborative nature that is quite important, and in a way, tackling the wicked problems of our present moment is a lot like trying to make sense of an earthquake in the Habsburg Empire. You need lots of different perspectives, and you need to figure out a way to collaborate across people who speak and communities who speak different languages, right? Even if the difference in that language has to do with disciplinary terminology. But to your question about whether there's foundationing, there's a host of efforts. They do tend to be, in the US context, they tend to be kind of project focused. And so that means the longevity really varies, right? Where you might have a fantastic cohort graduated, but then the funding runs out, and so the people who are involved do something else, right? That tends to be the model. Yeah.
I should point out that Julia is one of the world's most renowned experts on the issue of rare earth minerals, and is one of the few people to have done research in Inner Mongolia in China on the rare earth fields and processing plants it's Oyanbo, isn't it?
Bayan-Obo.
Bayan-Obo.
Close, yeah.
Sorry, nice.
That's all right.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jim O'Brien, a fellow here and formerly in the U.S. government. This is fascinating, and I think a great way of illustrating how many different constituencies and, say, bodies of law and decision-making bodies are involved in making any of these decisions. So my questions are basically, you say, we need to make decisions about this. So who are we, and in what venues do we make decisions? And I'll give an illustration from one of my many failures in government. we tried to create a program to penalize people who were committing crimes associated with environmental degradation, particularly in the rainforest. And commercial satellites, photos like you presented, were sort of crucial bits of information. They were extraordinarily important to the whistleblowers and local activists who would use those photos to go identify the actual culprits, often at great risk to themselves. But we hit a roadblock because the Lula government didn't want the US government publicizing this. The miscreants said, these are photos of our activities, so we actually kind of own some interest in what these photos are, even though they're, largely criminal activities. Lula said he wanted to do a quiet deal with these people. The local activists wanted it to be stepped up. We over time just found so much friction in the effort, and then the administration hit an end, so we never quite managed to make it work. But I never knew, other than a bilateral discussion between two governments, I didn't know where to take this to, or a body of practice to say this is the right way to handle this information. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts on how to construct that, and so that the right we can make decisions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I was hoping that by using the language of we, that you would see yourself in some aspect of it, right? Because I did mention I have an ideological agenda and an intellectual one as well. And thank you for bringing that example from Brazil. I think one of the challenges with dealing with these really spectacular and catastrophic environmental crimes has to do with what the threshold of success is. So, I mean, as you know, but I'll say this for the benefit of other folks in the room, as far as like an integrated satellite sensing and government enforcement institutional framework, Brazil is light years ahead of most of the rest of the world, because they have a direct line of communication between their very advanced tropical forest satellite monitoring network and an organization that's basically like the FBI but for the environment and for environmental crimes. And so the infrastructure is there. Are you
talking about Obama?
I am talking about Obama, yeah. And so the infrastructure is there. The issue is that institutional infrastructure is so seldomly fully funded or mobilized to its intended ends of stopping environmental crimes, or stopping an environmental crime is defined in terms of busting up an operation and making some arrests. Now, busting up an operation and making some arrests is an important part of the puzzle, but as I'm sure plenty of policymakers, scholars, and activists in Brazil have also told you, the drivers that push people into this very risky and very uncomfortable line of work need to be addressed, right? And that comes back to the familiar stuff of life chances. Right. One Brazilian interlocutor said very early on in my research in the country, a long time ago, said, as long as there is human misery and poverty, such as what they have, then the destruction of the rainforest will continue. And so that then redirects the focus away from a specific operation with a specific institution toward these broader-based development goals. Right? And that's frustrating because there's a lot that those broader-based development projects get wrong. But in terms of who's the we and what do we do, I think the lesson particularly from Brazil is not only building the institutions, but empowering them to do their work, while also building out and empowering broader constituencies to attend to what might be considered bread and butter stuff. Right? essentially, thinking about all this stuff on a larger scale and scope, thinking about human engagements with outer space and all of this, if anything, it amplifies the significance of these long-standing bread and butter things.
Just sort of to expand a little bit on that, it's important to remember that IBAMA, the environmental FBI in Brazil, was gutted and repurposed under Bolsonaro's regime. And so it's in itself fragile.
Yeah.
And just so people understand, the illegal mining in Brazil is not carried out by a few poor peasants. It's carried out by very heavily armed criminal groups, which
As well as poor peasants.
as well as poor peasants.
It's a tough line of work.
Exactly, but it's a very, very violent business, all of this. So, Kirsty, and then Chris, and then move on.
Thank you, Julie. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got two questions. One's quite brief. It's just a clarification, which is: are you saying that we can't have both the green transition and the level of rearmament that we're now currently looking at? Are those two things incompatible? And my second question is: I was interested in your point about the example of Serbia. And the lithium is, given the complexity of these issues, how do you empower local communities to understand what is going on? Because it's the kind of thing that journalists can't get, I mean, I speak as a journalist, can't get their head around. You know, it's very complex. It's, you know, we all want to go along with the green transition. You know, lithium's important, blah, blah, blah. We all want our mobile phones. How, you know, it's how do you get that, how do you empower the local community to actually make sure that their rights are going to be observed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So to your first question, the baseline, I think the most authoritative study on whether a one-to-one substitute for the energy transition, right, from fossil to non-fossil sources, whether that would be possible given the resources that we have on Earth. That authoritative study, it's like an 800-page exhaustive by Simon Misha at the Finnish Geological Survey, essentially indicates that a one-to-one transition is not possible. That's the baseline, right? So that kind of throws out the window the sort of, what do we hold constant? Or like if we hold our current economic status quo constant, the energy transition doesn't work. However, that's an argument against a one-to-one transition, right? That there's a lot to be gained from incrementalism, which I think is kind of lost in those discussions. So given both the material intensity of energy technologies as well as weapons, as well as the climate impacts associated with mining and military activities, I'm very doubtful under our current situation that we can make meaningful progress toward limiting warming to even 2 degrees Celsius, let alone achieve something like a transition. Now, with the growth in energy consumption, driven in part by data centers, AI, et cetera, but also the logistical demands for these growing military operations, it's likely that we're looking that green energy is more of an addition to the energy matrix as opposed to a substitution, right? Because all the new capacity that's being added is being eaten up. But from a material standpoint, based on our best estimations, rearmament really is not good for the energy transition. To your second question about how to empower local communities, the example of Serbia is actually really interesting because they seem they seem to be quite well organized and I think part of it is by virtue of the size of the country, the size of the population, and the integration between activists, journalists, and scientists was really quite impressive. But I think that going back to this question of the green transition versus rearmament, I think if we observe the laws, the international and the national standards that are in place, I think the additional piece to the puzzle needs to be that communities actually know what the material that's mined is going to be used for. And this is really important because, I mean, as someone who comes from a farming family, et cetera, I can tell you that it would really matter if someone proposed to dig up some of our fields for building renewable energy technology and helping everyone, or if it was going to go into lithium battery-powered assault rifles. That would really matter for us in our decision-making process. And so a lot of it comes down to enforcing and upholding the standards and policies that already exist with this additional bit of information, which then requires some measure of accountability on the part of extractive industries and who they sell to. Yeah.
Chris?
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you very much, Julie. That was really fascinating. I mean, way over my pay grade. I'm still trying to get my mind around some of it. But I would have liked to see, and largely we're talking about, let's say, green energy or something new. And in anything new, I think it's more difficult to assess risk. And risk is always a management issue. I mean, if you want to have zero risk, you wouldn't have cell phones. If there's too much risk, you may not want cell phones. So it's always seems to me a question of managing risk. Since you mentioned this fourth dimension of time and mentioned earthquakes, and in fact, you showed a lot of what looked like risky things. I mean, I'm ashamed to have anything to do with gold looking at that photograph. I guess my question is, have we done a better job as we move into a modern era of managing risk than people in the 19th century managed risk? When I think of coal mines in the 19th century, I'd rather be in a coal mine today, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. So, and then since I just spent 3 years in Serbia and heard more about lithium, then I mean, I'm still in therapy to get lithium out of my head. I mean, I'm so sick of this subject.
Literally or figuratively?
But I mean, I'm going figuratively. Right. Yeah. It's a perfect place to think about that kind of thing, just around the block from where I live. But seriously, I mean, I think lithium as the major ingredient in something that sits in all of our pockets is here to stay. Is the risk of it so great that maybe Serbia shouldn't do it? I mean, they looked at it very hard. They had a lot of experts come. And then they had a lot of other countries, starting with Germany, the United States, I mean, all kinds of countries, telling them essentially this is a good opportunity. And there were a lot of hedging to that. But ultimately, the idea was this is a risk that you should manage. By the way, you mentioned how local, villages were well informed. A lot of this issue drew a lot of people from the outside with very strong views, and explaining this to Serbian farmers out there. At one point, the president of the country moved his headquarters, moved his where he works, out to Jadar, and stayed there for a couple of weeks. He, in fact, asked the head of Rio Tinto to cut short his European vacation. As an American, I can say that with a certain amount of pejorative, and said, hey, get off that beach wherever you are and come with me down here to Jadar and explain what you're doing. So I'd like some, everything involves risk. I mean, crossing the street involves risk. I mean, and so Is it that we're not doing that? And I'm putting aside this criminal issue. I mean, I get that. That's in another league. But I'm talking about well-meaning people who think that the risk can be managed versus well-meaning people, meaning people who don't think risk should be managed and we should all get rid of our cell phones.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so the cell phone is an interesting place to start, right? Because the talking point that look around you, everything that was not grown was mined, that is often used to silence people who have very valid objections to how things are done. And I would say the counterpoint to that, we all have phones in our pockets and devices and all of this. If in fact all of us rely on minerals and raw materials for everyday life, then to me that points to maybe that then necessitates much more democratic governance and oversight. Maybe we then all have a say in how these things are sourced and the conditions under which they're sourced. That's the first thing. The second, with respect to the case in Serbia, I have a bunch of open questions. I mean, I was mainly there to learn. My team, there are people on my team who research lithium, but they do so in the contexts of Namibia, South America, and China. So it was really a learning experience for me. But some open questions I have really are, given that that the company that's proposing to open this mine also possesses the world's largest boron mine in the well-regulated context of California in the United States.
Some people would take issue with well-regulated California, but
oh, for sure. I mean, relative, yeah. I guess I'm sort of comparing it to other places within the United States. I wonder if this isn't yet another case where actually we need to push industry to innovate away from digging new holes in the ground. Right, and by that I mean there's thousands of sites, current and abandoned mining sites around the world where there's massive quantities of above ground waste. Right, and I put waste in quotes because any given mining operation is only going after a small percentage of the total stuff that they dig up. All the rest of that stuff contains really valuable things, but it's miscategorized as waste. And so I wonder if there's, because this seems to keep happening, right? Efforts to bring production for critical raw materials closer to home are running into this issue of, they're in agricultural areas, they're threatening protected bodies of water, protected or not. They are maybe occurring in indigenous lands or proposed to occur in indigenous lands. It seems to me that if we move away from this idea that resources have to be had by digging a new hole in the ground someplace new, that might resolve a lot of these issues, and with it a lot of the risk management things that come with it. To your point about are we better at managing risks, I would say yeah, but to your example about coal mines, I would rather be a coal miner today, but maybe not in China, right? That was the deadliest industry. That was the deadliest job for a number of years, right? They've taken measures to change it. And so the point that I'm making there is that in addition to the time component, there's also a space component, right? The potential for very high risk mitigation is there. There are stunning cases around the world where high-risk activities are carried out and everyone remains intact. But those same activities carried out in a different context, in a different regulatory environment, cost people their lives. Right? And so coming back to Jim's question, this is a matter that then comes down to institutions, regulation, enforcement, and accountability, right? To make sure that the highest standard is sort of made uniform. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question. But I forgot to announce at the beginning, we have wine and cheese downstairs after our discussion, and so we can carry it on there. So if you haven't been fortunate enough to be picked out to ask Julia a question, you will be able to downstairs. Yes.
Claudia, I'm a junior visiting fellow here at IWM. Julie, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I had 3 questions, but 2 of them were already asked, so I'm gonna, jump straight to the one related to the examples with the earthquakes. And I love the examples as a historian, so. When you were discussing them, you mentioned that we need multiple perspectives, and yes, I agree, but how do we deal with the potential overload of information, and how do you actually deal with all that information, because this is pretty amazing?
Yeah, information overload. So yeah, reading some of the archival stuff about how earthquake scientists during the Habsburg were trying to make sense of all of these reports coming in all of these different languages and trying to then coordinate aid operations seemed to me stunningly familiar to the struggles that people have coordinating disaster response today. Particularly, I mean, in a multilingual context, including, for example, in cosmopolitan cities, where you have lots of different language groups, right? How do you reach everyone? And so that, I think all of this actually comes back around to an argument for collaboration, right? Because in order to make sense of all of these different perspectives or all of this information that's coming in, whether it's in different spoken languages or different disciplinary languages or different forms of code or data, requires people who are able to make sense of it, but then also talk to other people who don't have the same. And the key element here, to be able to do that, to have the patience to do that, the key element is time. And to have the time and the patience to engage in the kind of critical communication that makes this kind of broader understanding possible, people can't be so tired and overworked and overwhelmed, right? And so what that comes back to then is a number of my answers come back down to fundamental things, right? So what my answer is getting to is actually questions around addressing the conditions of work, security of livelihood, and the kind of division and distribution of labor are fundamental to dealing with information overload and also coordinating speedy responses in complex situations like Habsburg earthquakes or something happening today. Thank you for your question.
Well, as Julie indicated, sadly, she leaves Vienna tomorrow very early in the morning. And so that is a great shame. But we still have the fortune of that wine and cheese downstairs. But before we do, as the Germans say, please a stormy round of applause for Julie Klinger.